So Parliament has been, at the start of the week, a bed of intrigue, because obviously we had the vote in relation to Boris Johnson and the no confidence issue, and the corridors of power were full of gossipy groups all planning and talking about what was going to happen and working out numbers and so on and so forth. It didn't feel like grand politics at any level, and it felt petty, but anyway, we all know what happened as a consequence. The thing is actually that atmosphere of intrigue has died off, but the thing that was interesting for the first 2 days after the vote came through was that even though Boris Johnson won that vote by the skin of his teeth, the approach for the opponents of Boris Johnson was to say that he'd effectively lost it. It was, he's so badly damaged now, he should go anyway, which makes the whole point of the vote rather futile. And it was an unpleasant atmosphere because people were bitter. You know, the vote had happened, they'd lost, but he hadn't won by sufficient majority that he could tell them where to go, and they were so close. And I mean people with a range of political opinions, obviously. But I did LBC cross-question with Ian Dale on the Tuesday evening. And one of the things that really struck me was that everybody wanted to talk about what a disgrace Boris Johnson was. On the panel, it was SNP, it was the Green Party, people calling in, and also a Conservative MP who voted against Boris and was a Remain voter, which is relevant to what I'm about to say. Because everybody started talking about Boris Johnson as a disgraceful Prime Minister. And no one, and I mean no one, mentioned Partygate. The variety of things that were mentioned were mainly Brexit. See, Boris Johnson is a disgraceful Prime Minister because he brought in Brexit. Brexit is a disaster for the country. How can we get rid of Boris Johnson? Because he's turned us into a little England, a country. Brexit. Boris Johnson should be got rid of at this point because of the Rwanda scheme. What's that got to do with anything? I mean, you might not like it, but they can't say he should resign as Prime Minister because of it. In other words, you realise that this damage that Boris Johnson has done himself and his own reputation and so on is really, even if lots of people who voted against him were people who Leave supporters and all the rest of it, underneath it all there's just this basic anti-Boris Johnson should go. And I pointed out that there had been a democratic process and that he had won the vote whether we liked it or not, and we had to accept losers' consent. And effectively my fellow panellists, but also people I've talked to in the Lords, said we now have to change the system so that you can get rid of him with a less number of people, that you can change the leadership. It shouldn't be a year. I think that's the argument, isn't it? We should be able to go for him again. And it's like, you're the ones who are saying that he's been unconstitutional and anti-democratic, yet here you all are trying to change the rules because it didn't go your way. And it just really struck me that that was what was going on. Having said that, Boris Johnson's Great Reset, God almighty, let's help people on benefits to buy their own homes. Now, I've got no objection to people on benefits buying their own homes, but of all the priorities that you might have if you're on benefits, that might not be your top one. We have a housing crisis. We have a situation where people can't afford to heat the homes they live in, and a government still announcing that they're going to make heat pump boilers compulsory by 1335 for net zero reasons. And Boris Johnson just confirmed that, which will mean that it costs you a fortune to get a heat pump that then doesn't heat your home very well. We've got an abandonment of the promise to reform leasehold, and if you now even buy a house on this new scheme, you'll be a leaseholder, which basically is a tenant in a glorified way, as we now know, and the government promised they'd reform leasehold and haven't done it. So what an absolutely snivelling, hopeless reset if he thinks that's going to win support for him. I think he's got something, but it lacks ambition. The other thing then is that I've been doing in terms of the House of Lords is the schools bill. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the schools bill is so weak, it started in the Lords, that they've managed to do this extraordinary thing, which they managed to unite the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the crossbench, people like me, more significantly, Tory backbenchers, but significantly influential Tory backbenchers who were part of the Conservative Party's great academy revolution and the free schools revolution. Real hardcore Tories united us all to say, what is this bill about? It's ridiculous. All it does is centralise power to the Secretary of State with no detail. The interesting thing was that when we actually started talking about the detail of what schooling should be, because a schools bill you'd think would have a vision for schools, but that's what is lacking from this piece of legislation, it was obvious that there were real tensions between, even amongst the Labour Party members, about what the curriculum should be, a national curriculum, what the curriculum should contain, how much centralisation there should there be a national programme or diversity. But the government haven't even allowed those kind of tensions amongst their opponents to emerge, because they've basically put in a skeleton bill which just says all the detail will be left up to the Secretary of State. And it's assumed that the reason they brought this bill forward, or one of them, is that they want compulsory academies, all schools to become academies, but they haven't got the courage to say it. Then those academies will lose their individual legal status and have to become part of multi-academy trusts. So it goes against every instinct that you associate the Tory education policies with in relation to any kind of freedom or autonomy and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's carrying on. So it's all been a bit bitty to start with. We will go on and discuss more substantial matters. I raised an issue in terms of somebody trying to say, somebody from the Lib Dems, backed by everybody, that mental health should be a focus of schooling, and I talked about the pathologising of ordinary individual young people's behaviours as mental health problems. So you can have a look at that speech. The other thing that will come up, and I'm glad that I managed to convince some of the people in the Lords that we should make this an issue, is the issue of sex education in schools, because we've now had revelation upon revelation, particularly brought to the fore by Safe Schools Alliance and Transgender Trends, that sex education in schools is really overstepping the mark at a general level in terms of parental decisions about what kind of sex and relationship education you should have. I mean, we should get rid of that and relationship. I mean, what are schools doing teaching people about relationships? But we now discover that sex education for kids as young as 7, 8, 9, you know, it's about masturbation, it's brought in kink, queerness. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And I'm not even talking at this point about the affirmation of gender as a fluid notion, and that children, their sex is kind of optional and so on. I'm talking about even beyond that, there's a lot wrong. So there is going to be amendments on sex education. I'm really pleased because I raised it. People agreed that was a good idea, and they've written the amendments because they're better at that sort of stuff than me. We've also had the announcement of the date for the second reading of the Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill. And this is a bill which is going to cause me some anxiety. To give you a taster for it, I am passionate about academic freedom, and I'm very worried, and have been writing for a long time about cancel culture on campus, and yet I really feel queasy about the solution being a piece of legislation that will effectively ban censoring academics. I mean, it feels wrong to me, and also cheating because it doesn't tackle the cultural problems that have led to that atmosphere. However, I will be supporting the bill, but I'll be putting in amendments, and I'm already nervous about the speech. Free speech has been very much in the news in relation to Cineworld's decision not to show the film that's had groups of Muslim activists and extremists outside cinemas in Bolton, in Bradford, or Sheffield, and now the cinema chain has pulled the film. I think it's called Lady of Heaven. And the reason why it's important to note this is because, I mean, apart from the fact that the film is made by a Muslim and it's basically a spat between two sections of Islamic thought, the mob aspect of it has gone further than being a demonstration, because it's basically a threat. If you show this film, we will, cause you real problems. And some of the interviews have been really frightening, because they basically said there will be consequences if you show it. And we all know that the Batley teacher is still in hiding because nobody took that up. And I mention this because if Boris Johnson wants a great reset and he wants to indicate that he's kind of, not a coward, he should be out there talking about Cineworld, taking the issue on. But we all know that people are nervous. that they're frightened they'll be accused of Islamophobia and so on, even though in fact if you listen to those protesters, they use all the language that we hear from trans activists on campus. I mean, it owes a lot more to safe spaces than it does to the Quran, let me tell you, the kind of arguments they're using. But nonetheless, we know that because they are Muslims, there's a fear that if you intervene, you'll be accused of somehow being a bigot or prejudiced in some way. And I therefore was put in an urgent question, or a private notification question. They're called PNQs. I've only found out what that stood for this week, so that's a big revelation. A private notice question, and tried to get it raised. I actually mentioned, it to the minister. He was very keen. We wanted to talk about it. It was rejected. I've now put it in as an urgent question, and hopefully it will be selected for next week. It shouldn't be left up to, minor backbenchers like me and the Lords. This should be a matter of major concern, discussed by, the Labour Party should be demanding a debate on it. The Lib Dems should be talking about it. The Tories should be voluntarily raising it, never mind anything else. And in the Commons, that should be happening. And at Prime Minister's question time, that could have been something that Keir Starmer had to go at Boris Johnson over. But oh no, they all stay clear. I'm glad that Nadhim Zahawi and that the Health Minister did talk about it. That's really important. But it was all a bit like when asked. And Michael Gove was asked about it this morning on the Today programme on Radio 4. And he made a slight joke. I always agree with my fellow minister. It was like sort of pathetic answer. He could have made much more of it. And I think we've got to make a fuss about these things. The only other thing to say to you is that I had a meeting with the Deputy Speaker, who was seeing all the newbies, and I think I might have mentioned it before, that he discovered that even though I'd been here for a year and a half, because we came in under lockdown, we didn't get the equivalent of our freshers pack, telling us what the do's and don'ts. There was no one around, we were in lockdown. And so he's been seeing everyone. It was very helpful, and I was able to raise questions and raise things. And he then said that he realised that people like me, but not just me, that everybody in lockdown had forgotten, as it were, the rules of the House, what the difference between a second reading speech is, a committee speech, which is not really a speech but is more conversational and probing, and the report stage interventions, which should be short and sharp and about amendments that you're about to vote on for or against, third reading even more minimal, and so on and so forth. And he said, I think that what I'm going to do is bring out a list of, do a reminder to the House of the rules, which was great. And it's just come out. It's all great, except it says he shouldn't read his speeches. Shouldn't read his speech. I mean, you've seen me around for a speech, but I obviously write every word. So when I spoke yesterday, I had like a few discrete notes I was looking at, but wasn't reading my speech. I think that you're allowed to just about read a speech for second reading. I hope so, or I'll go mad, because I write them so that I stick to time. As you can tell, I go on. And it reminds me exactly what I want to say, and I've got quotes. So I've been spending the last few days watching everyone intervening and speaking forth without notes, being overly impressed. And I'm anxious about what this will mean. So I'm glad to have the clarification of what all the speeches are. Terrorised that I'll be expected to stand up and by rote intervene in my speeches. So watch this space to see what happens. I'm off to a wedding this weekend, and you might wonder why I'm mentioning it. I'm off to a wedding that was postponed during lockdown. It's a family wedding, and I mention it because I hope they are very happy and we have a lovely wedding. But people had a very miserable time during lockdown. Their lives are put on hold. Everything was like closed down. The misery of that wedding being cancelled, I remember it so well. And should we have it with 30 people, and then they reduced it to 12 anyway, and they moved it, how much money it cost to move everything, the upset of it all, cancelled honeymoons, everything ruined. And one of the things that drives me mad in the House of Lords is that the people who advocated those lockdowns consistently refuse to acknowledge that anything happened for 2 years. We never talk about COVID anymore. It's never, and they had the nerve in the kind of mental health thing to say, Well, obviously there was a bit of a problem because, you know, mental health really spiralled during the lockdown period, and this was being argued by the people who advocated the closing of schools at every opportunity, didn't give a damn about the mental health of young people during that period. And I think that although we don't want to go on about the lockdown, I don't want to relive it all the time, I do think that Partygate has distracted us from a proper holding to account of that period. So the other thing that I'll be speaking about in the next couple of weeks is they've got a small, discreet little debate on the review of the emergency powers that were used for COVID. And I intend to go in and I will be reading it, make a long, passionate speech about the dangerous use of emergency powers during that period and how we should never let it happen again.